everybody, and a very warm welcome wherever you may be dialing in from. My name is Dylan, my pronouns are he, she, and I am the Global Head of Learning and Development at Equality Leaders. I want to thank you all for joining us today at our very first South Asian Voices Amplified Series event, forming part of our South Asian Heritage Month celebrations. Our series centers and amplifies South Asian voices, illuminating their journeys which have brought them to where they find themselves today. Their identities and their experience shape their stories. Our storytellers throughout the month draw from their personal experience to explore unique perspectives, as well as harness the power of storytelling to invite in empathy, compassion, courage, and curiosity. Their stories are not just a celebration of South Asian lives, but testament to their tenacity and indomitable spirit. And with that in mind, I am joined by award-winning author Manreet Someshwar. Manreet's Partition trilogy is her fictional recounting of the Great Migration of 1947, when India was partitioned to create India and Pakistan, and the aftershocks still haunt the Indian subcontinent today. Manreet, thank you so much for being here. Hello.
Hi, Dylan. Thank you for having me here. It is a privilege. And hello to everyone who's joined us from the UK, USA, India, and wherever you're dialing in from.
Thank you, Manreet. The honor and privilege is all mine to be in conversation with you. So shall we dive in?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
So I guess my first question to you would be, how has your experience of navigating this world as a brown woman with Indian heritage, culture, and traditions informed your own journey and your writing specifically?
Oh, that's an excellent question to start off, Dylan. But to answer that, I will have to tell you a story specifically about my hometown. It is a small town on the border between India and Pakistan, smack on the Satluj River in the Indian state of Punjab. It is called Firozpur. Now, Firozpur, at the time of India's partition, was a Muslim majority town. And to give some context to our listeners who may not be aware of the partition of the Indian subcontinent, so after some 350 years of presence in the Indian subcontinent, the colonial British Empire decided to pack up bags and leave. And we can later get into the whys of that. But the terrible sort of accompaniment to independence was to be the partition of the subcontinent into two independent nations. One would be the nation of India, and the other would be a nation created especially for the Muslims of the subcontinent called Pakistan. Now, according to the laws of partition, the Muslim majority areas of the subcontinent would therefore go to Pakistan. My hometown, 1947, was a Muslim majority town. But if you look at the boundary line today, which divides India from Pakistan, or East Punjab, which went on to be a part of India, from West Punjab, which went on to become a part of Pakistan, you see a squiggle around Firozpur, and then the line sort of continues in a northeasterly direction. That squiggle is where my hometown is. So Firozpur was a Muslim majority town but stayed on within India. And as a result of it, its very air was suffused with stories of partition, of people migrating east and west to what they had been told was their new homeland. And suffice to say that, I was like any other child. When you're growing up, you take a lot of what is around you as part of the background and you very conveniently ignore it, which is what I did. Um, in my adolescence, I became aware of what a messy town I was a part of. And I couldn't wait to flee it, which I did. I went on to do engineering, went to a business school, and then went to work in Mumbai, 1,000 miles away from my sort of hometown. I put the distance between us. But for some reason, there were always these memories stirring within me, which I could not put away. And Uh, that finally led me to a point where I decided I had to reckon with those, and I did the switch from corporate life to becoming a writer. And now, to answer your question specifically, I am a woman, I am a Sikh, uh, uh, and I'm also, when I moved out of India, realized what is called a brown person. Now, women are half of the world, and yet it's largest minority. Um, as a Sikh person, I have grown up in a community which typically, and we can go into the reasons later, has always punched above its weight. And when I came to New York and realized that I was a brown person and realized that I was often mistaken for a Hispanic, I realized that all these interactions, all these encounters, which were defining to other people, were what to me were just facets of myself, the way I was. But I have used all of these in my writing. In fact, I would say all of these have not only informed my writing, they have gone on to make me a writer. And as the discussion progresses, I'm sure I'll be able to sort of, extrapolate these further. But I also want to leave a thought with you and our listeners that, I was very struck when I moved to the US that in America, we say, God bless America. However, the culture I come from, both in India, in Hinduism, and certainly in the Sikh faith, our daily prayer, we end with Sarbat Dapala, which is blessings for the whole universe. And I feel when you grow up with an ethos like that, it's very difficult to see yourself as a minority, even though the rest of the world may see you that way. So I hope I managed to answer your question.
Yeah, no, thank you. And so many thoughts are running through my head. I kind of want to unpack so much of what you said. I don't think we'll have the time though, but speaking about that, that ethos, the fact that that saying that you shared with us, God bless the universe, it's indicative, I guess, in so many ways of taking that holistic view of humanity as a whole, highlighting, recognizing, acknowledge our interconnected humanity compared to a lot of Western nations. I guess the US is a great example of that. They can be incredibly isolationist, very much focused on their centering their own worldview, as it were. And for many years, this clash of Eastern and Western philosophies has created a great deal of conflict and misunderstanding because of that. And I believe there's a great deal to be learned from one another, right? That intercultural work is really needed. And would you say perhaps that is one of the things you seek to achieve with your writing? Perhaps a guiding philosophy is that interconnected humanity between us all?
Yes, in fact, I would sort of extend it further and say that the more, what one writing does is that it is meditative in a sense. In my corporate career, I never had time to slow down and think on a day-to-day basis of what my life was, what I was going through. But it's only when I stepped away and sort of immersed in the life of a writer that a lot of those things which had been in the background kind of surged forward and said, hear me, give me your time.
Mm,
And I do believe that the writing, my writing life and my sort of journey as a mother kind of started at the same time. My daughter often jokes that though she's an only child, that she has 9 siblings, which are my 9 books that I have written. And I do feel that that interconnectedness that I was aware of, as I said, it was in the backdrop in all the stories that I was hearing of people who had become citizens of India, but still spoke of the Vatan, the homeland that they had left behind.
mm,
When I began my partition project and I started speaking to people who had lived through that tumultuous time, most of the people were elderly. They were also in a frail state. Their memories were failing. And I realized quickly that I had to go through several iterations to be able to get something that would be cogent to me. It was cogent to the person who was talking to me. But for me to
Mm,
be able to make sense of that, to sift through the trauma and get some understanding, would take several iterations.
mm,
And again, people would reiterate that what they missed was not just their friends and associates and colleagues or people, farmhands that they worked with, who now were Muslim and therefore sort of in the other nation, in the newly independent nation, and therefore citizens of another country. But they also missed the land. They
mm,
missed a particular tree which grew in their courtyard. They missed the sound of the koel in the morning. Now, it's
mm,
not to say that the koel is not there in Indian Punjab, but what I'm trying to reach at is that we are so fundamentally interconnected, not just with each other as human beings, not just sort of the Homo sapiens as a species, but us as a part of the universe, which includes,
mm,
beings to whom we do not add sentience. But if we go through an experience, we realize they are sentient. That
yeah.
tree, for instance, in the courtyard was still speaking to the elderly gentleman I was interviewing maybe 50 years down the line.
Mm,
So I believe that the ethos is really about the interconnectedness of our universe, the stories
mm,
which sort of bridge uh, are a bridge amongst all of us, stories which tie us, stories which even enlarge us. They give us a purpose in a sense which is beyond sort of this. I am Manreet and I come from XYZ and I do this. I think it's just an opening up of our own selves to sort of the
mm.
history and the beauty and the interconnectedness of it all. I don't want to sound like a mystic. That's not my
No,
intent. But I'm trying to convey what is so much at the heart of, in effect, storytelling. We started
mm,
off as people who, hunter gatherers, who at the end of the day would sit around a fire and listen to each other speak, listen to the person who told the best stories. And I think that instinct is still very much there. That tree is there beneath which we
yeah,
sat when we told our stories. Those
yeah.
birds and animals, the wolves who then we converted into dogs to sit beside us, all of it, we carry it within ourselves, the
Mhm.
legacy in our genes.
And that's exactly it. Storytelling requires a degree of vulnerability from all of us, those who tell them, but those who are also open to listening and learning from them, right? And that vulnerability that emerges from storytelling, that time together, connects us and brings us together. And in so many ways, that is what a lot of us are missing, because storytelling is told in very different ways now. With the written word, for example, stories travel a lot further, but I guess lose a lot of their context, a lot of their rootedness, right, to that land, to the environment in which it was born, right? And I guess that would be another question of mine. When you were interviewing all these people and listening to these storytellers as part of your process to, create this rich mosaic of books and stories that you tell, I'm assuming a lot of it was oral histories. There's a big oral tradition, I'm assuming, um, in a lot of these communities, versus that of the British Empire, which, as we know, was centered upon functional, relied upon bureaucracy and contract and everything written down. So, what was that dynamic like for you, taking those oral traditions and oral histories and converting them, translating them almost?
Yeah. No, so when I started my writing journey, I wasn't even aware that I was going to start it as a writer. We had moved to Singapore for my husband's work, and since I had worked as a road warrior in my corporate life, I wanted to take a sabbatical, which is what I did. However, very quickly I realized that all those stories, which I had heard, were speaking to me. They were whispering in my ears and they wanted to be heard. And I thought, well, you know what? I'll just put them down in a Word document and I'll be done. I was an executive and I knew how to deal with these things. But one story led to another, and I realized that I had seen it while growing up, I had heard it, and my adolescence had coincided with what in India we call the militancy period in Punjab, which during that time I remember the people in my town saying, this is like a repeat of 1947.
Mm.
And when I was doing my research, I realized that I did not understand it. I had witnessed it, but I had not paid attention enough to try and unravel what was happening. So, which is what I began doing at the start of the millennium. And I was struggling because we were in Singapore and there was some material available in the Singapore National Library. But, as you said, the British are excellent record keepers. So I had a perspective, but in terms of understanding what the people had gone through,
Mm.
there wasn't much available. And here I have to share with our listeners that partition is considered the events that unfolded in the wake of partition, the migration, is considered the largest migration in modern human history. It is estimated that 12 to 15 million people moved east or west to get to their new homeland. 2 to 5 million people lost their lives. However, when I was growing up, I didn't find those stories in my history textbooks. I did not find it in literature at large. I do read Punjabi, I read Hindi, I read English. And while there is some excellent literature on partition, it is very sparse.
Mm.
For a comparison, I live in New York City, which is the home of the Jewish diaspora. And every year there are these wonderful narratives that come out, memoir, fiction, graphic novels, all of them tussling with the Holocaust. And to my mind, this was our Holocaust. This is what we had gone through as Punjabis, as Sikhs. And where was the information? Where were the stories? They were not accessible, they were not available. And I remember my husband telling me at that time, well, why don't you start with your family? Start speaking to them. And that's exactly what I did. I went back home and I started speaking with my family, and they were pretty aghast because I was naive. I had started with this approach that I will speak to people, they will open up, they will give me their stories, and I will begin my
Mm.
understanding. But people who have suffered trauma, who have lived through a very difficult period in their time, when they have lost everything and then have to rebuild their lives, the only way they can do it is by looking forward.
Mm.
So, what they're doing with the histories is they're burying it.
Mm.
They believe they're burying it for the time being, but it becomes a habit because that's the only way you can take the next step forward. So, asking my family and then my extended family and then my neighbors and my hometown to open up to talk to me was a very difficult task. And I can say that if there's one thing I am, that's persistent. So I stayed with it. Just I had a small recording device. I would uh, interview them, tape them, make my notes, and I was just gathering these piles of books without any sense of where I was going to go with them. But I was aware that these were very fragile, they were precious, and that I was collecting them. I was gathering
Mm.
them. At the same time, I was very confused. I was not getting a handle on why this was happening and why was I not being able to thread a coherent narrative out of this. And I remember interviewing an elderly Sikh gentleman who said something, and sort of the penny dropped for me. And he said that um, I'll say it in Punjabi. If there are any Punjabi listeners, they'll get it right away. And then I'll translate in English. And he said, Puttar, kise de haath saaf nahi. And he said, in this catastrophe, nobody's hands are clean. And the reason for that is that in Punjab, where sort of the acts of partition fell and which my family experienced, it was a syncretic society. There was no sort of, this is a Muslim colony or this is where the Hindus live and this is where the Sikhs lived. It was a very assimilated society. People shared, from the last name, you could not tell whether the person was a Muslim or a Hindu or a Sikh.
Mhm.
They dressed similarly. They lived in colonies where the Hindus, Sikhs, and Muslims lived cheek by jowl. So, women raised each other's children, which is what women do in communities. So you cook food, you share with each other, you're sitting in the courtyard doing your work, and your children are running around, and you're raising each other's children. And then when partition happened, and suddenly people realized that, oh, I'm a Sikh, and therefore I have no right to be in Lahore anymore, or I am a Muslim and I cannot be in Firozpur anymore, and I have to flee. We had what in India we call the epic Mahabharata replaying all over again. At the heart of the Mahabharata is brother turning against brother, which is exactly what our political leaders, the founding fathers, Jawaharlal Nehru, Vallabhbhai Patel, certainly Mahatma Gandhi, had foreseen that when partition happens and violence erupts, we will have a replay of the Mahabharata. And that happened. Brother turned against brother. And therefore, the violence which happened was horrific. And India's preeminent sociologist, Ashish Nandi, in fact, says this was like an exorcism. Because this brother, this sister, this family, this neighbor who was so much a part of you, you had to now exorcise yourself of them to claim to be a resident, a citizen of this new nation state. So
It forced people into that them us mentality, right?
the othering, the
Exactly,
othering,
the othering and in groups and out groups, and really focusing on those differences. As you say,
yeah,
your village, which is, one tiny little pebble on where that axe fell, um, before was, very multicultural, well assimilated village. People just were neighborly, took care of each other, community was important, and all of a sudden, it was our differences that defined us.
yeah.
And you speak to that trauma. And I guess in many ways, this is just one example in history where intergenerational trauma really has played out in a very, very uh, vivid, uh, horrific way.
Absolutely. I been here in New York City now 10 years, and I have learned something about the US as a nation state, how it was founded. And I remember a conversation with somebody where they shared this quote with me that amongst the Native Americans, who were the original inhabitants of this landmass, there is a saying that, when you crack a whip, the lash, the final, when it hits you, the lash of that resonates for 3 generations after.
Mm,
And scientists and biologists tell us that trauma is carried in the bloodstream for at least 3 generations. And certainly, when during the writing of the Partition trilogy, during the research, and now that the trilogy is done, and when I speak with people, I find it very comforting that young people, my daughter's generation, are often the ones who come up to me and speak to me, and they say, "Look, we don't care what the politics were. We just want to know what happened."
mm,
And I feel really gratified because our history textbooks are not doing anything about telling us these stories. In fact, I believe that the textbooks which were revised recently have just a paragraph on partition. And my mission, and I use this word with intent deliberately, is with the partition trilogy to bring to sort of the consciousness of us as a people, our collective consciousness, that partition was the price we paid for the independence of India.
mm,
Because every year in India on 15th August and in Pakistan on 14th August, we mark the independence of these two nations, and rightly so. But the project of independence was a project of nation building,
mm,
a project which is very strongly associated with the founding fathers, with male narratives of nation building,
mm,
of going ahead and surging forward. But the narratives of partition are the narratives of the price that we paid. They are the narratives of trauma and cost, which disproportionately fell upon women, which is why in the Partition trilogy, I try to center women, to bring them front and forward, to rescue their narratives from the interstices of history.
Mm.
Because it is not that when partition happened and there were people on the ground, there were some researchers who were trying to collect. What they were more interested in was collecting data. So when a refugee arrived at a camp, the questions being asked were, where did you come from? What was your village? What is your name? How many family members, male, female, etc. However, a lot of the women during this interaction were saying things which the record keepers and most of these clerks, in fact, I would bet that they were all 100% men, were either not hearing what the women were saying or they were deliberately ignoring what the women were saying so that it would not get entered into the records. So, for instance, there is a phrase which came up over and over, both in the oral archives that I gathered, and also when you go through some of these recorded archives, women are saying we were badly used. Anybody with any understanding knows that this woman is saying that she was traumatized, she was sexually abused. And instead of making a record of that, the men are just ignoring it.
Mm.
So, and to compound to that, when these women reached what was finally their home, where they could be safe, they were told that they had to zip their lips. They could not talk about what they had undergone. So they had to bury their trauma literally within their bodies,
Mm.
which drove many women to diseases which we now understand, illnesses which we now classify as PTSD, depression, madness. But that's what the women had to deal with.
Mm.
So when I did my research and realized that these were the voices which were there but were not being paid attention to, I was very clear that I wanted to bring these narratives forward. And that is what I'm talking about in terms of trauma. You know, it just is there. It's
Mm.
I remember one of the women kind of telling me that this pain that I carry is not just with me in my body, it sits like a piece of furniture in my home. I see it, the others don't.
Mm.
So it is very visceral, it is very vivid, it is there, but somebody has to deal with it.
Yeah.
Somebody has to open it up to story so that we can air it, we can get it out of the way,
Mm.
dust it off, and reoccupy that space.
Mm. And this erasure of histories, these untold stories, seem to be happening on many different complex but interconnected levels. So on the one hand, you have those who have survived this trauma, and as you say, in order to process and carry that, they are focused on looking forward, on looking to the future, and they don't want to talk about it. You then have the colonial gaze, who know full well the bloodshed, the trauma, and everything else that has been inflicted upon people, communities, the land, and so tend to, not write about that, not record that, because that would make them look, guilty of these crimes, as it were. But then you also have the a lot of things being lost in the oral traditions versus what is recorded, and so the list goes on. Um, have you always wanted to be a storyteller? I should ask you that. And uh, what is it that drew you to becoming one?
Um, well, you know, Dylan, as I said, I grew up in India, in a hothouse of academia. My parents, my father was a lawyer, my mother was uh, a teacher, a working woman at a time when it was slightly rare. She went on to become a principal. And we were a family of four daughters, one son, and we were brought up by my parents who were fierce feminists to grow up and have careers. As a contrast to where most girls are brought up to get married. So I was very aware that I had to pursue a career. I certainly didn't want to get married, and I went on, as I said, to do engineering. Then I went to business school in Calcutta, and then I went on to have a corporate career in Mumbai. And I was very happy with what I was doing because it was fulfilling, it was rewarding. I met my husband during at the management school, and yet there was a vacuum I sensed within me, an emptiness, a space which, for some reason, I could not fulfill. Work was not fulfilling it for me, and but as I said, when you're working, your mind is primarily engaged with other things, and I sort of managed to keep it at bay until I went to Singapore, which gave me the physical distance that I needed from my hometown, from my country, and also gave me the free days, that space and time which I needed to view my past with, sort of a fresh pair of eyes, in a sense. And no, to answer your question, I absolutely did not want to be a storyteller, because when I told my husband that, you know what, I'm going to embark on this project, which was initially just researching partition and gathering those oral archives, and he was, I guess, sensible enough to tell me that that is going to take a lot of your time. How do you intend to do it? You'll have to physically be in India, but we are in Singapore. And I very quickly realized that the tug of that project outweighed my sort of corporate career, and also the sort of handsome salary and the compensation which arrives at the end of each month, which makes you feel valid. I was getting far more validation from sitting and going through the archives in the Singapore library, or going to my hometown and speaking to people. And I just upped and left my corporate career at that point in time and started to pursue this path. I do not want to sound mystical, but I think writing chose me. I didn't choose it. And I spent close to 9 years before my first published book came out, called The Long Walk Home, in which I look at the turbulent 20th century history of Punjab through one family. And the making sense of those stories that I heard has taken me forever. I'm now in my 24th year of writing. I've published 9 books. 5 of them actively deal with partition, with the trauma of partition, with the stories of partition, with my attempts to center women in those narratives. And I am hoping that I have managed to fill that vacuum within me, and also the vacuum that exists in storytelling, stories of partition in sort of the world outside. And I'm also hoping that I've encouraged some of those young people to go out and seek their own narratives and add to what is, in the end, a very sparse, a very scarce resource that we currently have on sort of the biggest cataclysmic event of the subcontinent, if not one of them, of the world at large. So yeah, I mean, storytelling is an ongoing journey, and I'm just hoping that more and more of us are participating in it.
Yeah. And it sounds to me like, you say writing chose you, but it sounds as if you needed to go on this journey of finding yourself, of self-discovery almost. It gave you purpose, filled a void in some way, which must be incredibly empowering, but also perhaps bring up or tap into a well of a lot of mixed emotions and a lot of trauma in many ways too.
It does, Dylan. And I think a lot of narratives that we grew up with, that I certainly grew up with, are what are called the mainstream narratives. Chinua Achebe said it wonderfully when and I'm paraphrasing here, he said that until the lions tell their own story, it is always the victor who will be celebrated.
Yeah,
So it's who gets to tell the story.
yeah,
So when I was growing up, as I said, there was very little mention of partition in our history textbooks. We were all celebrating and marking independence and the founding fathers in a very masculine narrative of nation building. And I remember there was this book, it's ostensibly narrative nonfiction. And I say ostensibly for a reason, which will get elucidated as I speak further, called Freedom at Midnight. It is written by Dominique Lapierre and Larry Collins. It came out about close to 30 years after India's independence in 1947. It is largely based on Dickie Mountbatten's memories and recountal and recollection of 1947, the independence and partition of India. Now, I, I'm not laying blame on the writers or Dickie Mountbatten himself because we are all human. And when you have been through a momentous event at the helm of it, which is what Dickie Mountbatten as the last viceroy of India was, there is a tendency to conflate things. There is a tendency to exaggerate and amplify your role in it. Also, considering that Dickie Mountbatten came under a lot of criticism for partition eventually. And also, these are two writers, white writers, who are not Indians, who are bringing this narrative forward. And yet, all of us in India to this day read that book. That book is probably one of the highest selling books on Amazon. And when my publisher and I were deciding on the pitch, how do you market the Partition trilogy? This is a counterpoint to Freedom at Midnight. This
mm,
is our account of our independence, our partition, our catastrophe. And I think it's very important to recognize that until we seize our own narrative, until we tell our own stories, the stories that exist outside in the mainstream will always be their viewpoint. I
yeah,
am not bringing an othering here. I am stating a fact, which is that everybody has a story to tell. And if you can do that with empathy and with a great amount of attention to the facts that undergird it, then you should be telling that story
yeah,
just to correct the imbalance. And to end that, there is a very popular GIF which I want to share with everybody, which is that the British colonial empire gave so many countries in the world a happy Independence Day. And yet, the history textbooks of Britain to this day do not really talk about partition of India or
mm,
partition of, for instance, Palestine, or numerous countries from where Britain finally departed and granted independence,
mm,
is because the British Empire was there, their footprint is there. And I think it is important for the UK to engage with those histories because they are not histories of the native people, they're not histories of South Asia, they are your history as well
mm,
because you were there.
mm,
And it's
yeah,
important for us to get these stories because the stories are linked, they're connected.
absolutely. I love that. So, thank you for offering that perspective. It's incredibly powerful. We have a comment from one of our listeners that I feel is important. We kind of bring in at this point of our conversation, Manrit, and the question is, how did the partition impact the lives of your family members, and what do you know about their experiences when you went back to your village and your community where you grew up?
As I said, my sort of partition project, my gathering of oral archives started with my own family. It took me a while, but I can give you the story now because I lived through it over various iterations. My father's family hails directly from Firozpur, which even at that time was a town, it was not a village. Firozpur has traditionally, historically been a large garrison town. It sits smack on the Satluj River, and Punjab, Punjab is it's the land of five rivers. It was a name which the Persians, when they came to India, gave that land, the land of five rivers. So Firozpur, historically, as I said, has had been a garrison town at the time of Maharaja Ranjit Singh, who was the first Sikh king or emperor of a large empire and kept the British at bay for the longest period of time. Firozpur was a garrison town. At the time of India's independence, it was a large cantonment town with a large arsenal of arms and ammunition. And it was very critical because at that time, violence had broken out in Punjab. There were a lot of soldiers who were demobilized from World War II who had arms on them and were actively perpetrating and engaging in that violence. So it was important that that arsenal doesn't fall into the wrong hands. And there is speculation, we do not know because this has not been recorded, that that was one of the reasons why Cyril Radcliffe, nudged by Dickie Mountbatten, decided to keep that arsenal and therefore the town of Firozpur within the boundary of India.
Mhm.
But having said that, my father's father, my paternal grandfather, was a owner. So at that time in eastern Punjab, the land owning families were typically Sikh, and the people who worked the land were Muslims. So the farmhands were all Muslim. And when the violence broke out, and we have to remember here that independence happened for Pakistan on 14th August, for India on 15th August, and the boundary line was made public on 17th August. So, to the already simmering population who has no idea where they're supposed to be, who are facing the brunt of violence that has broken out amongst Punjabis, comes this news that there is this boundary line and you need to move for safety to the right side of the boundary line. Most people went to see the boundary line. You know, these are villages. If you say there is a boundary line, then where is the boundary line? So
Mm.
there is a lot of confusion and chaos happening. My grandfather, who was literate, was faced with a situation where he was informed that a marauding horde of non Muslims was going to attack the farmhands who were his responsibility that night. So he reached out to a distant relative in the Indian army, arranged a military truck, got all those farmhands into the truck, and in the middle of the night, moved them across the border to the safety of Pakistan. This is a story which my grandfather would narrate in parts, and it was only much later that I managed to piece it together because when I started my archive, my grandfather had passed away. But I remember when I was growing up as a child, my grandfather used to live in what we in India call the Haveli, which is sort of the old, for lack of a better word, mansion, the sort of the old big house. My parents
Mm.
had built their own independent house, which was about a mile away. But every Sundays we would go for lunch to that place and have lunch together. And I guess I was always keen to hear stories because I was the only one who would sit with my grandfather. And he had this, in India, we call it a thali, which is a curved plate. And my grandmother would make peas pulao, which is really basmati rice, white rice, fluffed up and with green peas in it, and
Mhm.
homemade yogurt and pickle. And we would eat together with our hands from that plate. He was elderly. He was very soft spoken. He would always dress in white. He had this white turban. And as I tell my daughter, if you had a vision of whatever, sometimes when they show us what a good person is like in storybooks, he was that. He had a white flowing beard, very
Mm.
gentle eyes, which would crinkle with laughter. He would tell me those stories. I guess I was listening to them, a part of me, but I put them away. As I was growing up, I just forgot all of them. It's only when I started researching that when my mother told me and my father told me, and I was like, aha, I knew about it. I had just buried it in my own way, you know. I was
Mm,
the second generation which was burying those, or third, burying those stories away. And yeah, so to cut a long story short, that's what my uh, grandfather did. And my father, to his dying days, always recalled his ustad, which is a Hindustani, an Urdu, a Punjabi word for a guru, a teacher, who would come to teach him both Urdu and painting. And my father never managed to get in touch with that person again. We don't know whether he survived. But he, because he was left behind, he was not amongst the farmhands. Much later, he was hidden in a house, and at some point in time, again in a military truck, he went hidden in a large suitcase which my grandmother prepared for him. And she packed him rotis and pickle so that he could eat in the journey, because they did not know how long that truck would get held up to cross
mm,
a distance which was literally less than an hour by a Tonga ride, by a
mm.
horse driven carriage away. So, yeah, I mean, I could go on.
Incredible, sure, absolutely incredible. Thank you for sharing so openly. I think it's fair to say that throughout our conversation so far, this common theme of erasure of histories is very clear in whatever shape or form that's taken, whether it's the colonizer or whoever it is, right? But the fact is that there is vast troves of these untold histories there, and they do tell us stories of community, identity, resilience, belonging, stories that are so crucial and can be applied to our lives today, right? And what we're experiencing, of course, in very different ways. But I guess my question then is to perhaps bring this into today. In your perspective, how has this erasure of these histories, or the forgetting of these histories, impact our South Asian communities today?
Dylan, that's an excellent question, and it is as broad and deep and vast as I think all of humanity. My attempt with my writing is to address that question, certainly, because, you know, there are so many of these wonderful quotes. The past is a prologue. The past always haunts us. It comes back. It is present. The past is present. When I started the Partition Project at the turn of the millennium, I had no idea that 24 years later, partition would become so relevant again. There are
Mm,
people who ask me in India, journalists, when I do press interviews, how did you know it would be so topical? And I say, search me. You tell me, why is it so topical? And I think, there is, I will quote Ashish Nandi again, who's India's preeminent sociologist and has done a lot of work on partition. And he says that at every table in the subcontinent, and he includes India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Nepal. When we are having conversations, the dead are uninvited guests at all those conversations.
mm,
And I think what he's saying is that there is this presence, whether you want to call it the unacknowledged presence, that piece of furniture in the room, the white elephant, the elephant sitting in the room, but it is there. And unless we address it, we will not be able to resolve the conflicts that we have today with our erstwhile family members, now newly divided into separate independent nation states.
mm,
And I feel that is so relevant because another example that I can give is that most Indians, and not just the young people, people of my parents' generation, when they look at the current map of India, the assumption is that this is the map that the British left us.
mm,
And we could not be further from the truth. The truth of the matter is that the British decided to finally, after 350 years of presence in India, decided to depart India because one, World War II had bankrupted them. Two, World War II had exposed the hypocrisy of the British Empire and its reason for being in India.
mm,
So the British could not wait to cut loose because violence had broken out, and the idea that this violence may impact white lives was something which would not be countenanced back home.
mm,
So when the British were leaving India, not only were they creating two independent nation states of India and Pakistan, by the laws of India's partition, the princely states. Now, India had 565 princely states, which is a shockingly large number. And the British India was two entities. One entity was directly governed by the British. The other was the princely states, where there was a resident, a British resident, who would then report to the viceroy, British viceroy. So they were nominally independent, but really they were under the control of the Queen.
mm,
So, by the laws of partition, each of these 565 princely states could choose to accede to Pakistan or accede to India or choose to remain independent.
mm,
And a large number of these princely states, except for one or two, were in what is today the territory of India. So imagine if they had chosen to be independent. As one of the political leaders said, that would be like mutton curry. They would be like pieces of mutton in the fabric of India, which is the curry of India.
mm,
So within a period of less than 8 weeks, the Deputy Prime Minister of India, of the interim government, Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, who was also the Home Minister, took on this humongous task of speaking to each of these princely states, negotiating with them and getting them to sign the instrument of accession before 15th August 1947. Otherwise, the chaos that would have
mm,
descended upon India, I mean, I shudder to even think of what would have happened.
yeah.
So, all these stories are relevant because they have been erased.
Mm,
You know, the idea, the role that the British played in the politics of India, I mean, at a bare minimum, the idea that the map is not given to us, it is a map that we put together as people.
mm,
As Vallabhbhai Patel says in Lahore, which is book one of the partition trilogy, which is set in the months leading up to the independence of partition of India. He says, state by state, piece by piece, we have put this country together. Do not assume that, the British left us this. They left us nothing, really,
mm,
except
mm,
a large degree of chaos. So,
yeah.
yes, I mean, I think it is an unending task. It is an ongoing journey. It is something we all need to participate in to better understand ourselves, our role in the place we find ourselves in the time in history where we are.
Mm.
Storytelling is sort of what will really save us.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And I'm just conscious of time. So I guess my final question to you is remembering these histories or retelling these histories essential to what it means to be South Asian today?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I let me give you an example. I think examples which are really tiny stories are the best ways to illustrate any point. When I moved to New York City, I remember one of the first few days I got into a yellow cab, which is sort of the taxis in New York, and the driver was a brown person, with shorn hair. And when I told him our destination, he starts driving, and within a minute he kind of swivels his neck and says "Kidda." Kidda is a Punjabi shorthand, a catchphrase for howdy, as the Texans say, or, what's up. And we started talking in Punjabi. And I learned soon enough that he was a Punjabi Sikh. His hometown was not too far from where I had come from. He had fled in the aftermath of 1984, the pogrom that happened in India, seeking safety and refuge. as far away as he could get. And the cab ride ended, we got off, and my daughter she was 12 years old at the time, and she's making eyes at me and saying, "That was so creepy. How did this guy know where you're from?" And I told her, "Look, that's the thing, when you speak more than one language, when you have grown up in a certain culture, when you know your roots, it's not too difficult. Of course, I wear the kara as a Sikh, which I think is what helped the person, or maybe there was just an instinct start speaking with me. And then later I learned that amongst the cab drivers in New York City, the the majority of first names are Muhammad, the majority of the last names are Singh. Now, Singh are people who come from Punjab, they are my community. And the reason I bring this up as an example of why this is so important is that for my daughter at that point in time, something which I was trying to encourage her, which is to learn our language. And my daughter, just so I can tell people, has grown up entirely outside of India. She turned 1 year old in Hong Kong, and then we lived there for 11 years, and then moved to New York City. So, yes, she visited India all the time. My in laws, my parents. My husband and I come from different parts of India. We speak a different language, we have different cuisines, we have different religion. So she, finding herself in the midst of all this, obviously decided English was her language, and that's what she was going to stick to. But that particular incident with the cab that day left an impression on her. It made her aware of who she was. And here we were in a new city. New York City is an absolutely fantastic place, and I call it home now. But it can be a hugely daunting city to a newcomer, and to the eyes of a 12-year-old especially. And here she was, and it was a kind of touchstone. It told her that she could find herself and people like herself who had shared the histories that her parents had, even in a place which was so far away.
Yeah.
And I don't know if I've managed to convey it well enough, but that is the reason why we need to tell and retell and share and reshare these stories, because they bring us closer. They remove the other from the equation, because once you have heard another person's story, that person is not a stranger anymore.
Yeah.
That person is somebody who acquires a certain history, who
Yeah.
then stands there in front of you as a father or a mother or a brother, somebody who likes a certain kind of music, who has a certain story to tell of their own.
It reminds me of a wonderful quote, and funnily enough, I've actually got it written down here by an author called Vivek Murthy. And Vivek wrote, "Stories make individuals feel connected and promote a sense of belonging. Tales help us understand who we are, and they give meaning to our struggles and comfort us when we are suffering or afraid. They bring us together." And I think that's a wonderful way to summarize this conversation and everything you've shared with us. So thank you so much, Manri. I'm sad to say that our time is up. We have 1 minute remaining. And again, I just want to, on behalf of everyone listening in and having taken the time to sit with us today, thank you for sharing so openly. And, for those of you wanting to support Manreed and her work, get out there, order copies of her books. They're available right on all major book selling platforms, wherever you are in the world. And as I mentioned earlier, today is just one of 2 events that we're going to be hosting as part of South Asian Heritage Month. So please make sure you visit us at equalityleaders.com. You can register for our next event, which is actually going to be same time tomorrow. That's going to be a panel event entitled Brown and British, that really does speak to exploring identity and what it means to be brown and British today. But Manreed, again, thank you so much for your time. We all appreciate you.
Thank you so much, Dylan. It's been fabulous chatting with you. I want to thank Equality Leaders as well, and Meenakshi, whom I hope to meet at some point in time. And thank you for all of you who tuned in. Let's not ever stop telling our stories.
And on that wonderful note, take care, everybody, and we'll see you soon. Bye
Thank
for
you.
now.